Hello everyone, I'm Trish Lynch from IOHR in London. Thank you for being with us for another episode of our Human Rights TV. Digital technology has transformed the way we live, communicate and share with each other right across the globe. Whilst this technology has bestowed us with many benefits, the very same technology has created many new threats to human rights, the rights to privacy and free speech increasingly under assault from governments, hackers and criminal elements operating in cyberspace. With us today is Mr. Jim Killock, the Executive Director of Open Rights Group, the UK's first and only digital campaigning organisation. With over 3,000 activists, supporters, ORG is a grassroots organisation that works with local cyber activists across the UK to safeguard privacy, speech for all. Mr. Killock, good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, you're the Director of Open Rights Group, the UK's only digital rights campaigning organisation.
Yeah.
Tell me more about what digital rights are and why they're so important to us.
Well, we think of digital rights essentially as your human rights in the digital world that we live in today. So things like privacy and free expression, these can be enhanced or threatened by digital technology and the companies behind them. So what we try to do in the digital rights movement is to try to get our human rights enforced so that we continue to have privacy and are able to express things as we want and wish within the law. And also we have free expression, free association, all of these sorts of things. And actually due process is also part of this as well. Your rights to have things looked at by courts rather than companies just making automated decisions, for instance. Mm-hmm. And there is this move really for computers to be in control and make those fine judgments. And in a way, the Cambridge Analytica thing is all about that.
Recently, the UK and the US released their first ever joint technical alert, warning against malicious Russian hackers who have been targeting routers connecting people's homes and offices. Basically, they've been spying on millions of people. How do we, as private citizens, protect that data? What do we need to do?
Well, it's very hard when it's the government, and let's not forget that if the Russians are trying to spy on us, so are the Americans and so are our own government through GCHQ. And GCHQ and the NSA in America, we're involved in effectively sweeping up vast amounts of information from UK citizens via cable taps on the edge of the UK. And that effectively is mass surveillance. And it is actually, I'll be honest, right? If the government is trying to get hold of data, it's quite hard to stop that. Okay. And similarly, if governments are acquiring data from platforms like Facebook or Google, that again can be very, very hard to stop. There's very little you can do about it. There are things you can do as an individual, of course. You can either choose not to share as much, you can choose not to use some of these centralized platforms, you can use encryption and things like Signal or things like Signal to protect your information when it's in transit. You can do those sorts of things. But I think we have to expect the law in the end to be the thing that really protects our privacy, not just, well, I'll defend my privacy, I will invest in all the tools, I will set all the things up on my computer and I will delete my Facebook account. Well, you can do that, but it's an incredibly limiting kind of experience. And if we're saying to citizens, really, your choice is to do it the really hard way and have your privacy, or else just forget it. Because every government, every corporation is going to be surveilling you, well, then that's not a reasonable choice to put to people. We do have a right to privacy, and we have that because we don't want our data to be exploited in ways that we haven't agreed to, that are unfair for us, and so on. I think that's the really key thing about this, really. It's your personal personal control over your destiny and how you're understood. That is why privacy is important to you.
And presumably an organisation that had the right resources would be able to fairly quickly get a comprehensive view of who you are and what your likes and dislikes are.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of very, very true, particularly with things like Facebook and Twitter and so on. You put a lot of information into these platforms, and it is, in Twitter's case, most of the time entirely public. In Facebook's case, it's semi-public or maybe public, depending on how you post and what you say, whether it's viewable by the world or not. But also with Facebook, they encourage you to like pages and to like particular posts or share articles you share or whatever. They also are able to see what pages you're visiting because Facebook widgets are on all of these big, more or less everybody's website, and that tracks you too. And between all of those things, frankly, Facebook knows more or less everything about you if you're not careful. And that's how advertising is targeted against you, because they use that information to say, well, this person's left-leaning Guardian reader, that person is a Times reading, right-of-centre person who doesn't like trades unions or whatever it happens to be, and then advertising can be targeted, and whether that's selling you a particular sort of car or whether it's trying to convince you of a particular political opinion, that's how that information is used. You think it's for your benefit when you like somebody's page, but it's not really.
Just to gather even more information on you.
Yeah, it's for the Facebook to know exactly who you are and what you believe.
With the allegations of Russian cyber interference in the US presidential election, including hacking into voting machines, tell me just how vulnerable Western democracies really are to this kind of interference from Russia.
Well, I think if you decide to invest in electronic voting systems, online voting systems, electronic voting booths, then you're making democracy incredibly vulnerable. And I think it's worth pointing out at this particular point that both Wales and Scotland are thinking about doing this for elections in their countries. Our organisation strongly suggests that you don't, because you're asking for Russia or somebody else to either actually try to interfere with the count of the election or to claim that they have. I mean, what happened in the US, as far as we understand, they haven't managed to tip over actual votes and change actual voting results, although, at the end of the day, we have to trust computer forensics people to tell us whether that's the case or not, which is not like a paper ballot where you can watch the paper ballots being counted. But even if we trust all of that, they were trying to get into election systems. Why? Possibly to overturn the result. More likely to create this kind of effect now, where everyone's going, gosh, did the Russians actually interfere with this election and turn over the votes directly? Did they manage to decide who won? Is Putin really in charge even of how our votes are counted in America?
It gives them a lot of power even if they do nothing, doesn't it?
That's right, they don't have to do anything. They just have to let us all worry and let the conspiracy theories fly. And you've undermined democracy, which I think is ultimately the aim here. Putin does not want democracies. He doesn't want democracies to be credible because that is a threat to his power. So if he can make everything look corrupt, corruptible, incompetent, vulnerable, then he's on a winner.
Now, your organisation has campaigned against the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act, known as the Snoopers Charter, which was ruled invalid due to its extensive surveillance capabilities granted to EU countries to monitor their systems. Tell me more about this unacceptable and illegal practice. What is it and why is it illegal?
Well, what we challenged was retention of phone and internet records and the like, and we're just basically asking the European Court of Justice to agree with its previous conclusion that this was not an acceptable practice, because it was Irish and Austrian challenge, in fact, a year or two before, where Digital Rights Ireland and some Austrians had challenged the national governments and said, look, you can't retain all of this data. That's a huge breach of everyone's privacy, because effectively you have this detailed knowledge of everybody and they never agreed to it. That information isn't necessarily safe. And I think in the Irish case there were also examples of, for instance, journalists' information being accessed and then sources being exposed, or just simply police doing things like looking up the email, the phone records of their daughter because they were worried about who their partner was and whether they were still in contact with them, this kind of thing. And that's obviously reckless behaviour, and it's a breach of people's privacy, and it happens because the data has been retained and because there are little in the way of access controls for the police. And this is still the case in the UK right now. not only is all of this data retained for about 12 months by the governments, asking the companies to do that, but also the police self-authorise for requests. So if they want your phone records, they sign a piece of paper, they get it signed by somebody slightly more senior in the organisation, and then the telephone company has no choice but to hand over that information. And we've simply argued that this data should only be retained when there's an absolute necessity. Maybe there's a particular criminal gang or something like that, or there's a particular location where some crime needs to be investigated. And then also when the data is accessed, then it should be signed off by somebody independent. And that's what the European Court of Justice said, yes, that is what we meant a couple of years ago, and yes, the member states do have to do this.
10 years after your organisation took on major telecom giants such as BT and Virgin for their use of Form, which is a technology which tracks a user's online habits and then targets them with ads. Tell me more about this particular case, and tell me why is it more relevant now than ever in light of the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook scandal?
Well, that is very interesting, because I mean it is a very similar sort of thing. And what was happening with the company Form is that they wanted to take all of your internet traffic, look at it, and then profile you for advertising purposes so that BT could sell advertising in the same way that Google or Facebook can. And if you phrase it that way, you might think, well, so what? The thing is that you kind of, if you're a telephone operator, telecoms operator, you shouldn't be looking at and recording everybody's traffic. It's bad enough that these other companies are doing it, and for sure they should be made to limit what they do too. But the idea that you just, because these people are bad, let's let our telcos get on with the same thing and make it even worse, that's kind of what that was about. And of course, if a telephone company intercepts my communications with you, you can't agree to that. That's just happened. And that's why that's meant to be confidential, and they're not meant to have a role in looking at your emails and web page visits and so on. And of course, they would end up with information that they never intended. They'd end up with knowing who you'd, which doctors you'd visited, which medical complaints you'd looked up on the internet. Lots of things you'd never expect British Telecom or Virgin or whoever to know. Suddenly they'd have that information.
Now, when we look at Facebook and its CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, find themselves right in the heart of a huge data scandal at the moment, after discovering that most of the platform's 2 billion users have had their data improperly shared. And also the social media platform has also found out that Cambridge Analytica have used 87 million Facebook users' data, which some people believe has been used to influence the US election. Tell me more about this scandal. How do you think it's going to unfold? And do you think a scandal of this magnitude could topple even a tech giant as big as Facebook?
Well, I sure hope it has the potential to topple companies like Facebook. Of course, they're sitting on tons and tons of cash, and their tactic is, as people get bored or less trusting of their platform, they go and buy others and continue to monetize the same people just doing things in slightly other places like Instagram or WhatsApp. So I think it's going to be hard for the company as a whole to be kind of pushed, but I think it really is going to be under an awful lot of scrutiny, and I think a lot of us are going to think about whether it really was wise for us all to just trust this platform with all of this information. So I think for them, they have such big commercial imperatives to use that information, to make that information accessible to other people to use, that has opened up a lot of these problems. Because how do they police all of the advertisers? How do they make sure that what they're doing is ethical, not just legal? And I think they are struggling with that. I mean, the sharing of third-party data, sort of the way that the Cambridge Analytica application, the Kogan application that they used to harvest friend-of-friends data. Yeah. That practice was actually, they were told off for it by the Irish Data Protection Authorities, I think back in 2013. They said, actually, you know what, people haven't really agreed to that, so that's not really on. Yeah. And they stopped that practice, but it was too late because that data had already got out there. So yeah, I think we have to really think about that data sharing and what data Facebook really have, And I think the regulators are going to get a lot sharper on Facebook, but so far nobody's really been able to kind of put a complete brake on them.
What do you think major social media platforms like Facebook, Google and YouTube should be doing to protect society from fake news, misinformation and from dangerous propaganda that could be put out there by terrorist organisations like ISIS or even hostile governments? What should they be doing?
Well, I mean, of course, they should be doing something. They should be thinking about what kind of easy measures they can do. I think a lot of them do, particularly on terrorism, child abuse, those sorts of things. There's a kind of, they have no choice but to try to address those problems. I think there are a few things with this. One is that often these problems are made worse in some ways by the actions that platforms can take. It's not to say you just give up, but even with things like copyright infringement, the attempts to sort of identify material and remove it creates free speech impacts that you don't necessarily want. For instance, on YouTube, any kind of song that seems to be owned by somebody is removed and deleted. And this means that if somebody uploads classical music recordings as a copyright company, then suddenly all that Bach or Beethoven or whatever gets misidentified when people have got amateur recordings of it, and can get deleted. And the same can happen, I think, with things like fake news, particularly with terror content. I mean, when somebody wants to criticise or report news or just say something is bad, they're likely to want to use some of the material that is actually promoting
as evidence of what they're saying. Yes,
and that means you have this quite high potential for that to be misidentified and censored, even though it is criticising these terror groups. So I think we have to be very careful about those sorts of things. Fake news, I think, is a trickier problem because the way that platforms work is they want people to click on things. They want people to share things. And of course, lies can be whatever you like. If you make stories up, you can make them up to be really compelling stories, like Trump being endorsed by the Pope. That's a really compelling story. It's a lie. You didn't have to you didn't have to create truth around that. You just lied. And that, but it is shareable and so on.
Many people will be aware of certain hacking techniques such as phishing or zero-day exploits. Can you tell me more about these hacking techniques and what other techniques are used to steal our data online?
Well, I mean, we're talking here about criminals trying to trick people into, giving bank details or passwords and so on. And this again it starts with the complexity of these machines, right? Computers are really, really complicated, and that makes it quite easy for them to be, have errors, have bugs, as they say, and to try and make computers completely secure is quite difficult. But also, a lot of these sort of phishing attacks, they're kind of social attacks, they're social engineering. So you get a thing that looks like it's from your boss, and it says, "Can you pay somebody £20,000?" Or you get something which looks like it's from your bank, and it says, "Can you remind us of your password?" And people go, "Oh gosh, I must do something about this because it's telling me it's urgent."
And of course, it all looks official, doesn't it?
It can look official. So the thing with this is, just use your common sense. Look where the links are going. Don't click on them before you've, checked that it actually is going somewhere sane. And think about why somebody might want your password, bank details, card details, or money, because the reasons are probably not good ones. So try not to do it. I think it's going to be interesting in the UK in maybe a year if the government gets its way and there is age verification systems introduced for people who want to look at online pornography, because this is going to introduce a whole new range of attacks, because people will say, "Please put in your bank details so you can look at the pornography." And they will, and they might get some pornography the other side, but they'll also get their bank details taken off and emptied, or your credit card suddenly charged with a whole load of money you didn't expect. So that'll be the next one for people to look at.
Jim Killock, thank you so much. It's been very interesting indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of IOHR TV. Don't forget to check out our social media feeds for right up to the minute notifications. And you can also check out our website to see other videos and to find out what events are happening in the near future. Until next time, goodbye.